For 5 years, we were told Coyote Pass was delayed because of money, conflict, and bad timing. But what if none of that was ever true? What if the land itself was the real problem and everything we watched was a distraction because no one waits this long to build unless they are afraid of what digging might reveal? Stay with us, because once you see the story through a different lens, every argument, every delay, and every breakup suddenly makes terrifying sense. Coyote Pass has become more than just a piece of land. It has turned into a symbol, a mystery, a question mark that refuses to be answered. For years, viewers have watched that empty stretch of earth sitting silently in Flagstaff, and they have been told again and again that the reason nothing was built was money, timing, logistics, family conflicts, and bad luck. But what if none of that was ever the real reason? What if the land itself was the problem? And what if the story the audience has been fed since the beginning was carefully shaped to stop anyone from looking too closely at what was really buried beneath the surface? Because when you strip away the emotion, the breakups, and the arguments, one fact remains undeniable. Half a decade has passed, and not a single foundation has been poured. Not a single home has risen from that soil. And in a family that documented every move, every tear, and every argument, that silence is deafening. The official explanation says utilities were too expensive, and yet during the same period, massive homes were purchased, luxury items appeared, and money continued to flow from the show. So the question lingers, why was there always money for everything except the land that was supposed to be their future? The more you look at it, the more the story starts to feel incomplete, almost rehearsed, like a script meant to distract instead of explain. And that is where the theory begins to form, not as an accusation, not as a claim of fact, but as a possibility that connects every confusing decision, every delay, every outburst, and every sudden change in direction. Because in real estate, there is one truth that never changes. If land remains untouched for years, despite resources and motivation, there is usually a reason, and that reason is rarely emotional. What if Coyote Pass was never delayed because of family division, but because building on it would have forced the truth into the open? What if the real risk was not financial, but physical, environmental, and irreversible? When the Browns bought the property, the purchase happened fast, almost recklessly, driven by urgency and vision rather than caution. And in situations like that, due diligence is often the first thing sacrificed. Soil studies, water tests, environmental impact reviews. These things take time and patience was not part of that move. And in northern Arizona, the ground is not uniform. It carries a complex history of mineral content, wildlife preservation zones, and naturally occurring hazards that require serious evaluation before construction even becomes an option. Locals know that some parcels remain untouched for decades, not because no one wants them, but because once you test them, you understand why. And that brings us to the details that were brushed aside on camera. The prairie dog colonies treated as jokes, the casual mentions of plague concerns laughed off as exaggeration, when in reality, those colonies are protected and tightly regulated because of documented biological risks and legal restrictions. Disturbing them triggers inspections, permits, and oversight, the kind of oversight that no one rushing to build wants to invite. And yet, building would require excavation, septic systems, wells, foundations, all of it forcing the ground to be tested, forcing officials onto the land, forcing answers to be written down, answers that cannot be edited in post-production. And that creates a different interpretation of the delays, not confusion, not incompetence, but avoidance. If the land carried environmental complications, whether naturally occurring minerals, unstable soil conditions, groundwater issues, or biological concerns, then every shovel of dirt would increase the risk of discovery. And suddenly, the constant stalling makes sense. The endless arguments about plans, the shifting timelines, the emotional chaos becomes a smokescreen, because chaos keeps attention focused on people instead of processes. And while the family argued, the land stayed untouched, frozen in time. Untouched ground is untested ground, and untested ground keeps secrets. And this reframes the tension. especially when certain family members showed urgency to build, while others resisted with increasing intensity, because urgency would have forced action, and action would have forced evaluation, and evaluation would have ended the illusion. And this is where the story takes a turn, because for years, everyone involved relied on internal knowledge, assumptions, and trust. No outside professional truly challenged the narrative until an outsider entered the picture. Someone not emotionally invested in the family hierarchy, someone whose instincts were shaped by job sites, not group dynamics. Someone who knew how to read land the way others read faces, and that presence changed everything. Because professionals see what dreamers ignore. They notice drainage patterns, vegetation gaps, soil color, density, and displacement. And to them, land speaks loudly, even when it looks quiet. And when that kind of experience walks onto a site that has been untouched for years, alarm bells ring. Because land meant for building does not sit idle without explanation. And the questions that follow are never comfortable. Questions about compaction, about water tables, about biological mitigation, about cost projections that go beyond surface numbers. Questions that do not fit neatly into emotional arguments. And once those questions exist, the narrative becomes harder to control because answers require evidence, and evidence cannot be argued away with feelings. And if those answers revealed that the land was unsuitable, impractical, or dangerous to develop, then the entire dream collapses, not because of broken relationships, but because of reality. And reality does not care about legacy or vision. And that possibility casts a long shadow over every choice that followed. The desperation to pay off the land, the urgency to clear titles, the insistence on control over plans, the resistance to independent action, all of it begins to look less like leadership and more like containment. Because if the land was compromised, then paying it off was not about building, it was about control. Controlling who had access, controlling what could be done, and controlling when the truth could surface. And that would explain why the land became a point of conflict rather than unity, why it never progressed beyond discussion. Because discussion is safe. Discussion keeps everything theoretical, but construction makes things real. And once things are real, they must comply with rules and regulations and disclosure laws. And that is where dreams end and consequences begin. And so the land remained untouched, not because the family could not move forward, but because moving forward may have meant uncovering something they could not afford to face. And this theory does not claim certainty. It does not accuse. It simply asks a question that has never been fully addressed. What if Coyote Pass was never meant to be built on? And what if everyone involved was reacting not to failure, but to a truth that could not be spoken out loud? Because once spoken, it would change everything. And as long as the land stayed silent, the story could continue. But silence has a cost, and over time, it begins to fracture everything around it, because secrets demand energy to maintain. And that energy is taken from relationships, from trust, from stability, and eventually from the people themselves. And by the time the family began to unravel, the land had already done its work, untouched, unchanged, and unmoved, while everything else collapsed around it. And that is why Coyote Pass remains empty, not as a victim of circumstance, but as a witness to something unresolved, something avoided, something that may never be addressed directly, but continues to shape the story all the same. Because sometimes, the most dangerous secrets are not buried deep. They're left right on the surface, waiting for someone brave enough to look down and ask why nothing ever grew there. As the years passed, the silence around Coyote Pass grew louder, and what once felt like delayed dreams slowly transformed into something heavier, something uneasy, something that viewers could sense even if they could not name it. Because the land never changed while everything else did. Relationships ended, alliances shifted, emotions exploded, and still the property sat untouched, like a question no one wanted to answer. And when people avoid answering a question long enough, it usually means they already know the answer, and they are afraid of what it will cost them to say it out loud. Because saying it makes it real, and reality has consequences that stories do not. And this is where the behavior begins to matter, because patterns reveal intent far more clearly than words ever could. Whenever momentum built toward action, something always interrupted it. Whenever plans moved closer to reality, conflict suddenly erupted. Tempers flared, and the focus shifted away from your land and back onto interpersonal drama, which conveniently kept cameras and conversations pointed everywhere except the soil itself. And this cycle repeated so many times that it stopped feeling accidental and started feeling deliberate. Because coincidence does not maintain consistency over years, but strategy does. And strategy often hides behind chaos, because chaos is distracting. Chaos keeps everyone reacting instead of investigating. And while everyone was busy arguing over who was loyal, who was difficult, and who was responsible, the land remained protected by inaction, untouched, untested, and legally invisible. And that protection mattered, because once land is officially evaluated, it enters a system that cannot be undone. Reports are filed, records are created, and future transactions are bound by disclosure. And if something unfavorable is discovered, it follows the property forever, which is why people who suspect a problem delay testing as long as possible, because ignorance allows flexibility, while documentation creates obligation. And that distinction changes everything, because if testing revealed complications, whether geological, biological, or environmental, then the land would shift from dream to liability overnight. And that possibility reframes every intense reaction, every controlling move, every insistence on authority, because control becomes essential when information threatens power. And this is where outside perspective becomes dangerous, because insiders adapt to the story they are told, but outsiders bring fresh eyes and different instincts. And when someone with professional experience enters a situation built on assumptions, the imbalance becomes obvious, because professionals do not negotiate with hope, they work with facts, and facts do not care about emotional investment. And when those facts begin to surface, resistance often increases, not because the truth is unclear, but because it is too clear and cannot be managed. And this would explain why independent action was discouraged, why building separately was framed as betrayal, why urgency from certain individuals was met with obstruction. Because individual action removes centralized control, and centralized control is the only thing that keeps secrets contained. And that is why the arrival of someone who understands land development shifts the entire equation. Because knowledge dissolves ambiguity, and ambiguity is the safe space where questionable narratives survive. And once that space disappears, the story must change or collapse. And collapse is what we began to witness, not suddenly, but gradually, piece by piece, argument by argument, separation by separation, each one relieving pressure by removing another person who might ask the wrong question or take the wrong step. Because distance prevents discovery, and separation stops momentum. And that is how delay becomes strategy, without ever being labeled as such. And this lens makes the timeline make sense, because the land did not fail the family. The family was reorganized around the land in a way that prevented exposure. And every major turning point aligns with moments when action became unavoidable, moments when decisions had to be made. And instead of moving forward, the structure fractured, which allowed the issue to be postponed indefinitely. Because you cannot build without unity, and you cannot test without intent. And without testing, the truth remains hypothetical, and hypotheticals cannot be prosecuted, disclosed, or challenged. They simply linger unresolved. And that unresolved state is exactly where risky assets are safest, because they exist in potential rather than reality. And that is why the narrative leaned so heavily on emotional explanations, because emotions cannot be verified, emotions cannot be regulated, emotions cannot be measured, and so they became the perfect cover story. And while viewers debated personalities, the land stayed quiet. While fans argued motives, the ground remained undisturbed. While the show framed collapse as relational, the real question stayed buried, not beneath the soil, but beneath the noise, and that noise served its purpose until it no longer could, because silence eventually becomes noticeable, especially when contrasted with years of promises and visuals and enthusiasm that never materialized. And audiences are not blind. They sense when something does not add up, even if they cannot articulate it. And that collective unease is what fuels speculation, not malice, not rumor, but pattern recognition, because humans are wired to notice inconsistencies, and Coyote Pass has always been one long inconsistency: a future that never arrived, a project that never began, a dream that never left the planning phase. And when you remove emotion from the equation and look only at outcomes, the outcome is simple. Nothing happened. And nothing happening for that long in that context is not neutral. It is a decision, whether acknowledged or not. And that decision protected something unseen. And unseen things are often the most influential forces in any story, because they shape behavior without ever appearing on screen. And that is why this theory resonates, not because it proves anything, but because it explains everything without forcing the facts to bend, because it does not rely on villains or heroes. It relies on incentives and risk avoidance. And those forces are universal. They exist in every industry, every investment, every human decision where loss threatens identity and reputation. And if the land was compromised, then admitting it would have meant admitting failure, not just financial, but personal. And for someone whose authority was built on vision and leadership, that admission would have been devastating. So delay became survival, and control became defense, and blame became camouflage. And over time, the cost of maintaining the illusion grew heavier than the cost of telling the truth. But by then, the structure was already cracking, and when structures crack, they rarely collapse in one moment. They fracture slowly until everyone is standing in different places, wondering how they got there. And that is exactly where things stand now, fragmented, unresolved, and permanently stalled. Because once the possibility of exposure exists, forward movement becomes impossible. And so the land remains empty, not as evidence of loss, but as proof of avoidance. And until someone is willing to invite the ground to speak, invite the tests, invite the oversight, invite the truth, nothing will change. And perhaps that is the real legacy of Coyote Pass. Not a failed dream, but a lesson in what happens when vision outruns verification, and when hope replaces due diligence, and when silence is mistaken for safety. Because silence does not erase risk, it only delays its arrival. And delay always comes with interest. And that interest is paid in trust, stability, and ultimately family. And that cost cannot be measured on a balance sheet, but it is visible in every empty promise, every unfinished plan, and every wide shot of untouched land that was supposed to be home, and instead became the quiet center of a story built on avoidance rather than resolution. By the time the story reaches its current moment, the damage has already been done, and the reason it feels so heavy is because nothing is officially resolved. Unresolved situations create tension that never releases, and Coyote Pass exists entirely in that state, suspended between promise and collapse. And that suspension explains why the narrative feels unfinished, because it is unfinished, not just for viewers, but for everyone involved. And when something remains unresolved, it becomes a weight that pulls everything else down. Conversations become sharper, trust erodes faster, patience disappears, and even unrelated issues become charged because the real issue is never addressed. And this is where fear becomes the dominant force, because fear thrives in uncertainty, and uncertainty is exactly what surrounds the land. No clear plan, no clear future, no clear explanation, only silence layered with excuses. And silence often hides more than it reveals, because if the truth were simple, it would have been stated plainly years ago. And the longer something goes unsaid, the more complicated it usually is. And this is why recent behavior behavior matters so much, because when people feel cornered, they narrow their focus, they protect what they can, and they retreat from what they cannot control. And that pattern is visible in how attention shifted away from building and toward ownership, how conversations stopped being about creating homes and became about dividing assets, because division freezes action and frozen action prevents discovery. And when people begin preparing for separation rather than construction, it signals that the future they once described is no longer believed, even by those who sold it most passionately. And belief is the first thing to disappear when risk outweighs reward, because no amount of optimism can overcome evidence. And while evidence may not have been shown publicly, the behavior suggests that something altered the internal calculus. Something changed how the land was viewed privately, even if publicly it remained framed as potential. And once that internal shift occurs, everything else becomes performance, a way to maintain appearances while quietly repositioning for fallout. And that would explain the focus on paperwork, on titles, on who owes what and who controls which portion, because those details matter most when exit becomes more likely than execution. And that shift transforms the land from a dream into a problem that must be managed. And problems are not solved emotionally, they are contained strategically. And containment often looks cold, controlling, and defensive, because it is driven by preservation, not collaboration. And that is why emotional appeals stopped working, because emotion does not resolve structural risk. And once risk is acknowledged internally, empathy becomes secondary to self-protection. And this may be why the land became a source of tension rather than unity, because it no longer represented shared future, but shared exposure. And exposure threatens everyone differently. Some people can walk away, some cannot. And those who cannot are the ones most invested in keeping the situation frozen, because movement increases danger. And this explains why the story never progressed. It only recycled the same conversations with different emotions, because progress required action, and action required answers, and answers carried consequences, and consequences were precisely what needed to be avoided. And this avoidance created a paradox. The longer the truth stayed buried, the harder it became to reveal without catastrophic fallout. And that trap is common in long-running disputes, because delay feels safer than confession, even when delay causes slow damage, because slow damage feels manageable until it is not. And by the time it becomes unmanageable, the cost of honesty feels unbearable. And so silence continues until something external forces change. And that external force often arrives in the form of outsiders, legal pressure, or financial necessity. And any one of those could eventually force the issue, because land cannot remain undefined forever. Taxes change, markets shift, laws tighten, and eventually questions must be answered. And that inevitability hangs over Coyote Pass like a storm cloud, because no matter how long it sits untouched, it still exists, and its status still matters. And if its condition is ever officially evaluated, the narrative will change permanently, not because of drama, but because of documentation. And documentation is impartial. It does not care about intent or emotion. It records reality. And that is the thing that has been avoided at all costs. And that avoidance has shaped years of decisions that seemed irrational on the surface, but logical when viewed through the lens of risk containment. And this does not require villainy or conspiracy. It only requires fear and pride. And those two forces together can produce remarkable denial, especially when public image is involved, because public figures do not just manage outcomes, they manage perception. And perception can be curated, while reality cannot. And that tension between perception and reality is the core of this entire saga, because the image presented was one of delay due to conflict, while the reality may have been delay due to uncertainty. And uncertainty is harder to explain, because it invites scrutiny, and scrutiny invites investigation, and investigation invites truth, and truth is irreversible. And so the land remains untouched, not because no one wants to build, but because building would end the story. And once the story ends, the consequences begin. And consequences cannot be edited or reframed. They simply arrive and reshape everything. And that is why Coyote Pass feels haunted, not by what happened there, but by what never happened. And the absence itself becomes the loudest statement of all, because empty land with years of resources behind it does not stay empty by accident. It stays empty by choice. And that choice tells a story, even when no one speaks. And until that story is acknowledged, the land will remain exactly as it is, a wide open space filled not with homes, but with questions. And those questions will continue to echo long after the cameras move on, because land outlasts narratives, and whatever truth exists beneath that soil will remain whether or not it is ever revealed. And that permanence is what makes the silence so powerful, because silence cannot erase reality. It can only postpone confrontation, and postponement is never permanent. And eventually, the ground speaks, whether through action or through time. And when it does, the story of Coyote Pass will no longer be speculation, it will be history. And by then, the cost of waiting will be fully visible in everything that was lost while nothing was built. Coyote Pass was never just empty land. It was a silence that spoke louder than words. Because when dreams stall for years without answers, it usually means the truth is being avoided. And whether the real issue was risk, uncertainty, or something never meant to be uncovered, one thing is clear. That land didn't break the family. The fear of what it might reveal did. And until that truth is faced, Coyote Pass will remain exactly what it is, a monument not to failure,